Alex Newman, thank you for joining us again today. Well, it looks like Education Week is pointing out something that we already knew. We have a crisis in teaching kids how to read. Explain how we got to such a sorry state.
Well, thank you, Duke, for having me on the program. And it is a national literacy crisis. This has been going on for years. And the simplest way to explain it is that they're using quackery in the schools. This is mandated under Common Core. And we've known this is quackery since the 1840s, when the Boston schoolmasters first rose up against Horace Mann and said they would not teach children how to read anymore using this quack, cite, whole word, look, say method, which is, of course, mandated under Common Core.
So what we're dealing with here is we've walked away from phonics, and we've talked briefly about this before, but let's take a second and apprise the audience. What is exactly phonics? It's the only thing that's ever worked really well. It brought almost universal literacy to America in terms of how to read. It's utterly common sense, and yet explain what it is and explain why we walked away from it.
Sure. Well, phonics is essentially, we have a phonetic alphabet where every letter represents one or more sounds. And so, of course, when you teach someone to read, you have to teach them what sound each letter represents and how you blend those sounds together to decode a word. This is totally different from, say, a hieroglyphic system of writing or, a pictographic system of writing. Like, think of the Chinese system of writing. There, a character actually represents a whole word, a symbol, an idea, a concept, whereas in our writing system, you have letters that represent sound. So this is how reading and writing was taught in nations and people groups that use a phonetic writing system for thousands of years, going back to the Phoenicians. And yet, in the 1830s and 1840s, this socialist humanist who wanted to fundamentally transform America, Horace Mann, decided to try out this method, the whole word method, where they would teach children how to memorize entire words as if the words themselves were the symbol, rather than a collection of symbols, each representing a sound. The quackery was totally discredited in the 1840s. The Boston schoolmasters rose up, wrote an essay explaining why this was quackery and they weren't going to use it. And it was dormant, shall we say, for another 50 years until John Dewey came and resurrected it. Today, it is mandated under Common Core. They have kindergarten children memorizing sight words, and they say they'll sprinkle in a little bit of phonics later, but the brain damage is already done. So it's a catastrophe. That is why more than 2/3 of the adult population of Washington, D.C. can't read. That is why more than half of California children can't read at even a proficient level. And this is a catastrophic crisis that is going to destroy America if we don't fix it.
Isn't it interesting that Common Core math basically prohibits kids from memorizing their multiplication tables, that discourages kids from memorizing necessary math information that allows them to build on higher math, and yet when it comes to writing and reading in particular, they want kids in a very ineffective way to have to memorize word after word after word by sight. So in what would work for math, Common Core says no. What won't work for reading, Common Core says that's the only way we're going to do it. And the $64,000 question, why is it that educrats, particularly progressive educrats, why is it that which has worked for thousands and thousands of years, whether it's reading, writing, math, or science, why is it that what works is no longer valid? Why do we have to change? And one answer I know you're going to give me is because that's how textbook companies sell more books, right? If we're doing the same thing we've always done, you don't need to buy a new textbook every 3 years, and textbook companies like Pearson don't get filthy rich. But from an intellectual and really a cultural and social perspective, why this constant changing of what works? What's the reason that modern progressive educators, they got to recognize that kids aren't learning how to read better? What's the angle behind this?
Yeah, well, I think at the lower levels, the teachers and the college professors who teach the teachers, we're all told that this is what works. But at a higher level, Dr. Sam Blumenfeld and I wrote a book, Crimes of the Educators, and what we show, I think, very conclusively with documentation from primary source writings of these characters is that they wanted to dumb down the American population to facilitate the emergence of socialism, collectivism, the smashing of Christianity, individual liberty, constitutional limited government. And so they realized that massive illiteracy or a lack of ability to read, to access the accumulated knowledge of mankind would facilitate this. And so you had John Dewey, with money from the Rockefeller family, took over the colleges of education, especially the key ones like Teachers College at Columbia University and University of Chicago, and then they spread this quackery outwards. And we've had a few incidents in American history where this is all blown up in their faces and people figured out. In the 1950s, Rudolf Flesch published his book, Why Johnny Can't Read, blowing blowing the whistle on this. Later in the 1970s, Dr. Sam Blumenfeld published The New Illiterates, showing how all the reading curricula in all the government schools were completely absurd, and that's why Americans weren't learning how to read. And this just keeps happening. And now it seems like we're going through another one of those cycles, Duke. We've had the New York Times expose this quackery. We have had NPR, National Public Radio, expose this quackery. Just a couple weeks ago, we had Education Week, which is a very prominent education publication, edweek.com, I think it is, expose this quackery. And yet it continues because somebody wants it there.
Yep. A country that can't read and access information for themselves is a country that is going to turn towards statism and ultimately even a kind of intellectual slavery. Alex, thank you so much for your time. Important stuff.